Welcome back to Sika Strength. We say that this is going to be a review of our training year, but it actually ended up being a 45-minute long shit talk episode. So I hope you enjoy.
So we're back with another kind of shit talk. So we're going to do just a 2025 training year in review a little bit, but rest assured we probably will venture off into unrelated areas.
Wouldn't be like us.
Of which I wanted to start off with something completely unrelated, just to piggyback off last week's podcast.
So not only are you taking a tangent, now you're just starting in the wrong direction.
I think you should start as you mean to go on.
Right.
But, they were talking about experts and everyone thinks they're an expert now and how we are really conscious of staying in our particular lane in the fitness area.
Yeah.
We actually omit two things very purposely: nutrition and injury rehab and prehab. But I was thinking of how annoyed I get when I have to step in for injury rehab. So an athlete would be like, this is sore. And this happens monthly, weekly. It's however often you interact with an athlete, one of them is going to be injured. And our first response is always, okay, can you go see someone in person who's a injury specialist?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to signal out a particular group of people here, but it's probably the first one that came to mind. Physios. And then they'll go to the physio, they'll get a series of like rehab exercises, tiny things, and then after like 2 months they're like, yeah, it's not gotten better, and you're like, hey, and then you have to come in and then try and fix it. And that always really annoys me, because I'm like, that's your job, this is your part of the game, we all understand how this works. Why can't you fix them? Why are my like success rates better with them than with when they go see someone in person? Like, why is that? It really annoys me. I'm like, this is your job.
It's such a waste of time as well.
Yeah.
Because usually that step it only happens after, as you say, 2 or 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be like quad Nordics and some actual work on their quads, and suddenly their knees aren't sore anymore.
Or you're like, let's get a bit of soft tissue work in, look at mobility.
They'll have wasted 8 months of their year.
And they'll have paid the physios like 60, 70 euro an hour.
Yeah, to go and do some acupuncture and some contrast therapy on them.
No, they won't even do that. But most physios aren't even trained in physical therapy,
manipulation.
Physical manipulation. Like something they'll either do themselves or something they'll do through practice, or they'll get educated somewhere else. Now, I'm not saying there's bad physios.
It's the waste of time annoys me the most. Because say whatever you want, the validity of coaching and the validity of our stuff working is better numbers. And if you've somebody and you're like, look, you can do 100, 120 easily in 6 months' time, or you can do it easily in a year's time, and then suddenly they're here for 8 months and you're like, we haven't gotten a valuable 2-month block of coaching in because people are injured all the time.
But my thing is, I'm not annoyed that the time wasted. I'm annoyed because they're not keeping their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
You're supposed to have hip fixed people when they're injured. And most often it doesn't happen. And the problem is, you'll get someone who'll be like, can you ask one of your friends, do they know anyone who's any good? And then they'll be like, literally one of my aunties said the other week, they were like, yeah, there's no one in my city who's any good. I've asked around and everyone said I haven't found anyone good.
Yeah, I'd believe it.
But there is great physios out there, that's the problem.
There's unbelievable physios out there and who do really good work. I think the other problem with physios, and this isn't a problem with physios, but this is a problem in the injury rehab world, is it takes daily work. Like, it takes a massive, massive amount of work. If somebody's after doing their shoulder, or they have a genuine big injury that's not some repetitive strain injury that's kind of crept up in them, they have a big problem. There's a huge amount of work needs to be done there, and yet, like, very few people can afford to go to a physio every second day.
Yeah.
Like, when I was playing rugby, I went to a physio every single day probably 5 days a week when I was in university. 5 days a week for 6 or 8 weeks. And like, it gets great results. They were a really good physio. It was a very good physio with a couple of people working for him. But that amount of work is very, very hard to replicate. Like, it's not just a thing of once per week getting a small bit of soft tissue work done. And even if it's the right amount of soft tissue work done, that's not going to fix a lot of the issues. Like, there's a massive amount of work has to be done on the other 6 days of the week.
Yeah, the problem is, I wonder, are good physios annoyed at bad physios? Like, are they annoyed about the industry?
I'd say they're seething.
Because I'm happy when there's bad coaches out there, because
Yes.
it makes those look even better,
Yeah.
So like if you see bad coaches getting bad results, I'm like, nice, that's
Nice.
good. But I feel like no one's going to lump in all coaches together. People understand coaches are different, but then the thing with medical professionals, you'll get like cultural things where it'll be like osteopath. You're seeing a chiropractor. You might as well be seeing a voodoo witch doctor.
Yeah.
Which, from my experience of being injured, of which I have been many times, I found that it's not really to do with the specific angle that these practitioners come with it. It's rather the person you find. So you could find a great chiropractor, or you could find a great physio or a neuromuscular therapist. It's almost irrelevant with what they've been classically trained in. It's rather the person.
And I think the classical training is a small bit of a barrier for entry, you know. Like if someone's a physio, they've spent 4 years in university, they're clearly quite committed to it. Maybe they've set up their own practice or working somewhere else. They've reached a certain level of commitment to that industry where you're like, okay, look, there's some hope here that person is going to be continually developing and that they're really going to be focused on it. But it is like the good practitioners we know are fully addicted to becoming better at it.
Yes, they're always kind of upskilling.
Which is the same with coaches. Like the good coaches we know are fully engrossed in what their particular sport is or what their particular avenue is.
It's tough as well because you kind of are almost in a little bit of a cult too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You're kind of like, this is how us chiropractors treat things.
Yes.
So then you're kind of at a place where you feel like you need to keep the walled garden a walled garden, and you're like, no, we don't do manipulations. That's terrible for you. You're not going to make You're kind of in a position where you're like, okay, I can't.
There's a funny parallel there with the nutrition world as well.
Yes.
Where it's like, I'm a dietitian. That person's a nutritionist. They're not a dietitian. They're not a registered dietitian or whatever.
Their name has no meaning.
That name has no meaning. There's no legal backing behind that. But then, and the walled garden thing really occurs there.
Yes.
Because they're like, no seed oils. Or they're like, no artificial sweeteners. There's these few buzz terms.
Yeah.
And then people outside of the walled garden are like, throwing the shit over the wall and they're bounding the shit back over, you know.
Yeah, but the thing then is, do you want to be in their walled garden is the problem, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
You notice there's lots of doctors on Instagram in the last few years.
Yes.
Doctors.
And like that's the exact thing we're talking about with that barrier for entry or the perceived investment up front. Is you're like, that person spent 7 years studying the human physiology.
But don't they have statistics? He was saying it recently. I'm sure it was one of the doctors were saying that by the time you've graduated, the stuff
50% of it.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I
and
wonder.
That's not a dig at doctors. That's not a thing like.
That's more so a point in how much medical science is progressing. I wonder how much of that 50% is made up with differences in treatment protocols, differences in pharmaceutical protocols, differences in the actual implementation of treatment rather than, like, I don't think their understanding of the mechanisms behind certain illnesses have changed all that much. Obviously they have in terms of like gut biome, cancer treatment. Those things are changing a lot. But I think there's a fundamental level of understanding that somebody who is a doctor, a medical doctor, an actual doctor who helps people, they have a level of understanding about human physiology that you then go to them with the perceived confidence that you're like, you can surely help me.
Like, are they trained, as the question is, are you trained to have an understanding of physiology, or are you trained to have a way of implementing corrections to the human physiology? Like, what are you getting trained in, like, for the doctor, you know, and are you capable of staying up to date, or is that an expectation on you then?
I don't like
nothing in, from my experience for biochemistry, nothing really progresses that fast that in 7 years you'd be totally left in the dust.
That's what I'm saying. Like, the fundamental backbone of things isn't progressing that quickly.
Like, you know,
the treatment of things is
yeah, the treatment and the implementation of what's there currently is definitely, and like, we know a doctor in Dublin who's like trying to push those as far as possible.
Yeah,
and he's a lot of views on what the future of stuff is, you know, and you'd see a lot of non-private GPs probably in a different manner, but of course then you're landlocked in a lot of legal issues. You know, one interesting thing is the sports science in hypertrophy. They're kind of fucked themselves now because a lot of them have put themselves in a position that they are the science-based training. That's what they call themselves. There's
Yeah.
science-backed training, science-based training. And now every time a new study comes out, if you're the science-based person, you're either expected to dissect this study and say why it's not worth your while from your followers, or you're expected to be like, this is now how we train, guys. You know, like you've got to move with it. Like it's it's a really weird thing because there's a certain group of them. There's a large number. I won't name any names, and I'm sure a lot of them are nice people and good coaches or whatever, but they're stuck in a position now where this new study comes out, and rather than waiting, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, like if you were, what I'd equate this to is if you were in sports science back in 2000 and someone said, come here, if you do a heavy back squat and you jump right after, you jump way higher. Imagine saying that in the 2000s and being like, I'm going to change the whole way I train. Yeah. And now 25 years later, you're like, oh, I don't really think it's that useful in training. That's how I feel like that they are in at the moment, because there's probably more research on hypertrophy done than ever. Jeff Nippert literally made a video the other week. Did you see it where it came out?
No, but I heard you talking about it.
Where he was kind of defending his position because, as he rightly said, if you look up science-based training, he's one of the first names to come up. If you look him on TikTok, if you look him up on YouTube, he's the person who comes up, and he felt like he had to defend his position because he gets a lot of slack because there's this certain culture now who are like anti-science-based training, which also doesn't make sense. You can't be anti-science-based training. What I also think means you can't really be a science-based practitioner. You can't really be someone who's like, no, I only obey the science. They're like, really?
No, what I think what you should be is you should be a scientifically educated practitioner.
Do you even need to be scientifically educated for hypertrophy training?
In terms of hypertrophy training, Garth, like, I think you barely need a pulse.
They're like, volume's not the main driver. 8s are fine. And you're like, okay, was 12s not okay? Like, you know, we'll say something from our point of view from sports performance, some strength training or weightlifting or whatever. So when we say high volume training, we mean 5/8s, 5/10s, 4 sets of 10, 5 sets of 10 or whatever, which is very clearly from the literature. There's none of them would argue with you that higher volume training is better. None of them are doing 3 max singles.
No.
So when we're coming at this from a sports science side of things, not sports science, sports performance side of things, we're saying higher volume compared to what we always do. And maybe you need to phrase that better, but you'll get a random comment on Instagram and be like, volume's not the key driver. And it's like, you've just parroted from your favorite person who probably actually has good programs. You know, a lot of times people ask us, what do you think of daily undulating periodization? They're like the DUP, you know, the Democratic of they'll ask, what do you think of DUP or linear progression? You're like, look, I don't care what term you're putting on it. Show me a program, and then I want to have a look at that. Because I do care what you're asking, but I don't care what term that person has put on it. Like someone asked me the other day, they're like, Angus doesn't like periodization. What do you think of that? And I was joking, and I was like, no, Australians are notorious for not understanding strength training. Angus is a dumbass. But here's a link to the podcast we were on with him a week ago, you know? And I think, like, you just, that kind of thing. Like, show me what you're actually doing. When you say volume's not the driver, show me how many sets you're doing. Because I guarantee you, the average hypertrophy or strength-based or physique-based athlete in the gym is doing way more volume than I'm doing in my 3 sessions a week. Doing way more 100%. Volume in our weightlifters. So from our point of view, that volume is the driver, you know? So then the question, you remember the thing used to be as well a few years ago, what even is volume? John Meadows was at the head of that. And I agree with a lot of his takes where he was really on the ball with that. He used to say a lot of like, when did the working set start counting? You know, a lot of that stuff is the nuance.
Junk volume, all this. It's an interesting thing because even the term volume in the sports science community from the millennium forward, right? The term volume, how you equate volume as being sets by reps, then the usefulness of volume versus volume load, then the usefulness of volume at working weights or volume load at working weights. All these things are essentially naming criteria put on something, right? The amount of work somebody has to do to elicit a certain response. And my perceived biggest issue in that world at the moment, the hypertrophy, science-based hypertrophy world, is everyone's arguing about volume being the most important thing, but the detail of that is very, very tiny incremental changes in volume. As you said, we talk about high volume work. Let's say you're doing high volume work on bent over rear delt flies in a Sika strength program. You're doing 4 to 6 sets of 8 to 12 reps. That's high volume work. That's what we perceive as high volume work. What's the load? Well, are you on the basic female strength training program, or are you on the becoming a horse program, or are you a professional athlete who's doing one-to-one coaching with us? That's where the differences in load come. Is it a 1.5 kilo plate, or is it 20 kilo plates each side? Like, there's people are arguing in this thing of like volume isn't the key, or volume is the key, or volume load is the key, or it isn't the key. They are talking about such tiny, tiny differences and minutiae in study and study design. Yet the differences in between people are absolutely huge. They're gigantic. Mm-hmm. I think people are losing the wood for the trees, or the forest for the trees, more than they ever have before.
That is a thing that we were talking about last week as well. Say, for example, if you take someone like Huberman, who feels like they have to keep saying new things to remain relevant, but we were looking at our own content, and we've obviously very consciously made this shift, say, over the last year, specifically over the last 6 or 7 months. It definitely started about this time last year, and you can see it on Instagram and YouTube. So we've over 100,000 followers in the last year on Instagram, and it was going from even less of saying new things and more of saying the same stuff that works more often, because that's what people both need to hear but also wanted to hear. If you look at the videos that do well and the feedback you get, and people saying this is what really helped me, or if you also, from our point of view, if you look at new customers, that's what people want from us. Is someone accuses on Instagram saying, you can see here that as people get bigger, they have to say more controversial things. All I said was, I want you to arch your back in your back squat. Like, I'm sure it happens to some people where you feel like you have to do things, and that probably is something that happens in their regard in terms of hypertrophy industry, because ultimately everyone's doing isolation style work. Everyone is doing pretty similar volume, but then they're getting into the stage of like, who's doing the higher volume? You know, it's like that Mike Menser versus the RP kind of crowd, where you're in a position where you're constantly looking for new things, and then these new studies are a great opportunity for new stuff, whereas we've made a really big decision, not a big decision, a decision that's kind of evolved slowly, is like, keep saying the stuff that works, that we know to be true, regardless of whether that actually gets you a lot of views, you know. And like, if we could go into it and start saying, you could start looking for really controversial stuff, you could start going down for Greg Doucette style stuff, or more plates, more dates style stuff, which is up to them, and I'm not saying of any issue with that. But what people have clearly been responding to is just keep saying the stuff that we know to work, you know, ultimately telling you how to program for weightlifting, how the technique works, how to program for strength training, how your system stuff works, the loading, peaking. Just keep saying the same thing that worked, and people seem to be responding to it. And I suppose the big thing as well is that, especially with social media the way it is presently, is the algorithm keeps showing it to new people if you keep making that stuff. So we are going to get sick of saying that before everyone who's ever going to see us is going to see all that stuff.
We definitely will. I also think the other thing that comes along with that is, as you continuously make those points, as you continuously paint a picture for someone, how well you paint that picture improves and changes, right? So if we're talking about how often you should squat, and we say you should squat twice per week, and that's applicable for almost everybody. The second time we say that, we're probably have been educated by 5 questions we got around that and what people's common concerns would be. The third time we say it, we're probably doing it with 150 extra people have run the program, plus an extra 20 questions we got and interactions with athletes. The 100th time you make the point for squatting twice per week, it's not a thing of becoming jaded. You could certainly become jaded and be like, lads, just stop asking the question. Instead, it's more refined. It's the poetry, not prose thing, you know. It becomes better every single time you have to make that point. It's a thing of Adam Savage talking about science educators starting off being terrible at illustrating certain points to the viewing public. But I think there's a lot of value to be said in making a point repeatedly over a decade and becoming very, very good at making that point. Like the information and the backing hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. Certainly the amount of validity behind that, or the weight behind your sentences, does increase over time. But I think there's massive value in the athlete watching this, or the coach watching this, in terms of how well you can illustrate certain points when you've been making those points for a number of years.
Definitely what's great to see is obviously PBs from programs, but I suppose to a certain extent, all hubris aside, you're kind of expected. But when people message you or leave a comment and be like, thanks so much for your comment, or the DM us, and they're like, really appreciate the stuff you put out because it's helped me massively. That actually is great to see from our point of view. Or when you meet people in person,
Yeah.
when we had our squat seminar and there was like 50 plus people squatting and everyone was like, thanks so much for your help all along or whatever. What's funny as well is like, you'd think as well that the content might be, so if you're talking about simple, straightforward content, you might be mistaken in thinking that is only for the uneducated athlete or the amateur athlete or the lower level athlete, but we just wrote a program for an outrageously high level athlete. It's kind of as high as you can get, basically.
Yep.
And you'd have a hard time discriminating between that and certain programs that would make sense for that athlete on the app, for example.
Yeah.
And I'm not plugging the app here, but
No, absolutely.
you'd have a very hard time. There's some nuance, obviously, specific stuff in it, like power testing, and there's some specific exercises that they're doing that make a little bit more sense for them for this particular sport, but you'd have a hard time, and that's not our first time doing that for someone like that, I'm saying. So knowing it works, it is really interesting that from our point of view, it's great. That's what we were talking about earlier, is I would hate to feel like we continue to have to look for new avenues and have to look for new areas to be capitalizing on. Now, they're nice when they arise, but I see from a lot of our content, especially on Instagram, because you can look at people's profiles, but when you get those positive comments, a lot of times, especially when the more basic it is, the more coaches you see in the comments, the more coaches you see sharing it, and you can see they're blue in the face. This happens nearly daily. Someone will reshare, and you can see all the reshares of a reel. And let's say we talked about Iranian wrestlers front squatting recently, and you're like, you should be front squatting for wrestling because it's really useful. And loads of them will be like, this is what the fuck I've been talking about.
Yeah, I love when someone tags someone in a comment and then that person comments underneath being like 4 thumbs up in a row or something.
Yeah.
You know for a fact that person's been trying to make that point for months.
Yeah, it's not that, no other coach has figured out what we're doing. Like, for example, we planned out the year for that high level athlete, and if you were to look at that, you could look at that in a textbook for sports science.
Yeah.
Not because it's revolutionary, it's because it works. That's why it is the way it is, for their specific goals. You could see that particular template would fit periodization. We didn't come up with periodization. That's just a manifestation of how you adapt to training goals.
That's the other thing I don't like about the kind of, in inverted commas, snarky science-based stuff a lot of the time, whether it's in nutrition, whether it's in hypertrophy. There seems to be this element of everybody else is getting it wrong except me, and here's why. When you look at really effective training programs, when you look at really effective technical frameworks, there is nothing new there. Like, there are probably books on shelves with dust that's been on them for 30 years that have similar progressions, or they might have similar key points in a framework. All of this stuff has been done at length. Now, is it in a form that's applicable to everyone? Absolutely not. I think we're at a point now where programs can be made very effectively for large groups of people with large degrees of variance across those people. It's certainly something that's been improved on massively. I don't think when a lot of the older models of, say, squat biomechanics or pulling biomechanics, a lot of the time when those models were done, they're certainly not being illustrated in a way where normal people will understand them effectively when they look at them. And there's very few kind of crossovers between the coaching world and the sports science or biomechanics world. That's improved massively. But the fundamental backbone of it hasn't really changed all that much in terms of how people make progress, in terms of how people should move. But it's rather the communication of that, or bringing that to a larger group of more general populations, has definitely improved massively.
I can honestly say I couldn't give a fuck what other coaches are doing. It's definitely less than ever. I think maybe earlier on we would have felt a bit more, you feel a bit more exposed, or you feel a bit more concerned because people do compare you to other coaches, especially you make a lot of content, and people will send you things, and I'll know where things will come. Like I was saying last week, I'll see a coach say something, and I know for a fact we're going to get questions about that, and fairly so. If you're watching content and you're listening to people, someone is valid to have a question about something that might sound unusual, or if it's different to what we teach. You could pick something in weightlifting, for example, but I honestly just don't care. But again, I'm not really judging anyone for doing that. Like, again, if you look at someone like Greg Duchette, or if you look at, I don't know, someone like Andrew Hiller, I don't know if he coaches people or not, but they make content based on dissecting what other people do. There's obviously a market for that. I just don't enjoy making stuff like that. We made a decision years ago not to do that, a very conscious decision. Part of the new show was obviously talking about people in a positive manner. Like, we get sent stuff super frequently where they're like, guys, what do you think of this crazy thing? And you're like, in my head I'll be like, that's fully, I can't say the word, that's so stupid. But I don't see a benefit in putting that out there, because when the coach isn't changing his mind, most of the time people aren't even going to try that thing. Like, you can think of something really stupid, no one's going to go try that thing. I'm thinking of a particular exercise in, I won't even say it, in, remember someone's really overloading a certain exercise. No one's actually going to go try that. So I don't feel like we've any onus to defend the public health by disavowing that and saying that that's a bad exercise that you should do. I don't think we've got any kind of responsibility to talk to that person. Ultimately as well, I don't feel like we're the ultimate arbiter for what is good training information or not. I don't feel like we're in a position where if we don't take it down, we're getting other people hurt. Our point of view is always just to make what we think works. Now, the odd time, look, if I see something happening a lot and we get a lot of questions about it, I am going to make something about it, you're going to make something about it. Like that, for example, that one where people are talking about having a neutral back when you're squatting. And it's a thing that you see a lot in the high bar squat specifically, so I'm not talking about the low bar squat here, where people are talking about the neutral back, and I see people making content about it, and then you get questions about it. But then you see athletes in our Facebook group having issues like that, or they'll say that they're using it, and then I'm like, okay, maybe this is a point where it's affecting us. So I don't feel like I'm making content to take those people down. I'm making content, or you're making content, to make our jobs easier, so we don't have to tell every single person or any athlete who might ask that question. They can see it immediately because they see that content too, people who are clients and customers. And like in that case, some of those people, none of the people, for example, making that, not to say that this is the only indicator if they're an educated coach or not, but a lot of them aren't very strong. Like, they were people in box style gym coaching this, making nice graphics, but if I had to guess, most of them couldn't squat more than 170 or 180, And I'm not saying that that is a good indicator of whether someone's a good coach or not. Ivan Abajev wasn't a very good weightlifter. I don't even know if he snatched 100 kilos. I don't think he was very good at all. I don't even know what his numbers were. It's not an indicator of your prowess if you're good at something.
Yeah. Oh, definitely not.
That's not a part of it. It's just that I feel like for some of this, for example, in this particular case, I can tell you that those errors aren't going to be exposed until things get heavier. Like, you can get away with it. It's the thing we talk about with squat every day. Like, if you're squatting 120 kilos now, you can do squat every day and get away with it, because ultimately humans are more similar than they're kind of diverse in some ways. So 300 kilos, 400 kilos is heavy for every athlete, even if you're large and in charge and capable of doing it. 120 kilos on average working maxes per week isn't going to tear you down as much as 250s will,
Yeah. The squat every day example is the one I wanted to talk about here, because any stuff we talk about, or any of the content we made where we spoke negatively about squat every day, is in no means a directed comment towards anyone. It's never a shot across the bow to someone be like, they don't know what they're talking about, or that's, any of those comments come from athletes of ours, members in the group, people running the app, people running programs in the old days, saying, I really want to squat every day. Can we make this program a squat every day program, or can we put it to 4 days or 5 days per week of squatting, which in some ways 5 days per week is more egregious than squatting every day, because you're actually going to be lifting heavier weights and doing a bit more volume at it. None of those are directed pieces. If anything, it's just like putting our arms around the people who are in some ways under our direction, or not under our care, but certainly under our direction, and saying, look, this isn't, I know where you're getting this. This isn't the solution you need if you want to get stronger, if you want to get faster, whatever it is. And it's more of a protective thing of, look, I know the content you're taking in. I know why you're perceiving that this might be a good idea, but this is definitely not going to be a good idea for you. And Squat Every Day was an example of that. There's been a few examples in the injury rehab world where I felt like I wish somebody would have done that to them too, you know?
Yeah.
But then it just comes down to the individuals out there who are, or the companies out there who are making content or making information available to people.
Yeah, except for, like, Joe Seedman's probably the only person who I'd consider an actual charlatan, who I'd say was...
Yes.
But then I think maybe he doesn't even know. Maybe he genuinely believes that. I think he might possibly.
Or maybe he does know, and it's like a concerted effort to be as bizarre as possible.
Yeah, like, ultimately, money talks, you know? And if something's working for you, if you saw a certain financial income, I mean...
I could see Joel Seedman making astronomical amounts of money.
Do you know...
Diabolical, I'd say.
I remember Angus, after the podcast, he sent us a particular podcast that went unbeknownst to people. Do you remember it was a rugby podcast or something?
Yes, I went and listened to it afterwards.
With Joel Seedman on it. I hadn't heard it. It was like 3 years ago. It was on a smaller channel, so it didn't get much airtime. And
lads,
it was very entertaining.
I wish we could just get everybody to watch that. Like, Joel Seedman was talking about never needed to warm up for sprinting. And he was talking about, like, real high frequency of sprinting, if I remember, and how much his sprinting improved. And, like, there's certain things that make it a sprint, like ground contact time and the actual stride and gait you're using.
Yeah.
And there's a point during that where the rugby strength coach guy is like, look, across all parameters, you're not sprinting.
Well, he went through frame by frame his gait analysis. Very good at gait analysis, very interesting.
Yeah.
He'd clearly had some really good education on the gait analysis of sprinting. It was very, very interesting stuff. But what I like about gait analysis and sprinting is they have their own nuances that they still argue about in their community.
Yeah.
Like, obviously we engage in it in terms of our athletes, but to be honest with you, when it comes to sprinting, technically, there's a couple of big hitters.
I was just about to say, there's a handful of things we throw at people
that work really well. You know, we don't ever actually end up in a position where we have to coach a 60 or 100 meter sprinter through the actual technique of sprinting. But you might get a place where a rugby player's trying to run faster and you have to give them the big hitters. So I'd liken it to a strength conditioning coach is trying to teach someone a power clean.
Yeah.
And they're like, ooh, could you stop bending your arms? That's the kind of thing I would globally place as. Now, I'll be honest with you, maybe I'm biased here. I don't think I am. Power clean is a full snatch or clean and jerk is way more technical than sprinting. And you'll see there's much more uniformity in the apparent model, I think, of sprinters over the same distances.
Definitely.
Compared to the technical nuances of someone's snatch or clean and jerking. Not to say that this is somehow a more worthwhile exercise, but in terms of, like, coaching pedagogy or whatever, there's definitely things that are really fine-tuned in terms of sprinting and that are definitely important when you're looking for that max sprinting 400 meters or whatever. But, you know, when it comes to, like, a rugby player, you're like, don't stand up straight so soon. Bigger steps. Less choppy steps.
It's funny. So those, like Broderick used to have a thing for years. I don't know if he still does it, where he'd be like, the Postit Note guide to clenbuterol or something, you know?
Yeah.
And the Postit Note guide tends to get you so far, right? So when you look at sprinting, as you said, but a rugby player comes to us, there's a Postit Note guide I'll give someone for sprinting, and by God, that will make them a significantly better sprinter over the course of 2 or 3 months. I think many people should be looking to refine their Postit Note guides rather than reading the fine text on page 1 or 2 of their entire manual.
Yeah.
Having a really good set of guidelines of, I want to get stronger for the next 3 months. Here are the 5 things I'm going to do and 5 things I'm going to concentrate on. I want to lose weight. Here's the 3 things I'm going to do to lose weight for the next 6 months. Rather than it being, I'm going to lose weight, so I'm going to do carnivore, but for the first half of the day, it's going to be raw. And then for the second half of the day, it's going to be slightly different. Or I'm going to do whatever, intermittent fasting, but on the non-training days, I'm going to fast for longer. Those kind of small scale minutiae really aren't for the general population. I get it, like, really like getting into the details and getting into the weeds on things, but if you just want results, pick a few simple things and just do those simple things fully. Like, if it's weight loss, just eat less food and do more work. If that means excluding a certain food group from it, exclude a certain food group from it and just stick to it. I feel like the bottom of every Postit Note guide should just have consistency on it, because realistically consistency should be there across every single one of those things you're trying to do in sport. There is really no place for that real short, sharp, intense burst, when in that less intensity and more consistency across the months or the years you're doing it will just make an absolutely huge difference.
Like, if you look at like snatch or clean and jerk technique, you know, we didn't come up with any of those parameters.
No.
They're just the parameters that people came to when they're looking to optimize how best does a human body do a snatch or clean and jerk according to the rules of weightlifting. And these are the parameters that make the most sense. And there's no new technique. The technique that works is the one that makes sense. They make great sense. If you understand them very well, the principles of why they work make perfect sense. They are inherently very intelligent ways of doing the lifts. That's why all the best lifts are done within those parameters that have been set. You know, no one set those parameters. No one said, this is the technique. That is the technique. That's how they happen between a barbell and a human body. There's nothing else that would make as much sense. And there's less efficient and more efficient ways of doing it. Now, of course, how you implement them, what you see and understanding them, and how you correct them are obviously completely different, I suppose, and different coaches would have different understandings of those and different ways of addressing things and different viewpoints on what's important. But ultimately, it does come back to one thing works the best and adhering to that. And you can make it in spite of and not because of arguments, but ultimately they're not correct. And it's not my argument, you know, it's not your argument. We didn't make these up, and it's not something we're trying to copyright, or it's not a thesis that we're trying to defend. That's just how it goes, and the evidence is heavily stacked in the favor of the better working better. Ultimately as well, I suppose you're not going to be the outlier, you know.
No.
Realistically, the chances of that. But I always maintain this as well, is that you want to be normal, you want to be average. Like, you don't want to have any quirky techniques. It's something we used to see a bit more in weightlifting a couple of years ago. It definitely seems to be less now, which is great, and I'm not really sure the reason of that change, but you want to be the same as everyone else.
Yes.
Technical model I'm following is the exact technical model that is the good tactical model. It's no coincidence that Anton thinks the same as me.
Yeah.
Bill teaches the same, 2 190 snatchers or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at Clarence's technique, he's going to follow that tactical model. That's how you lift the barbell in the most efficient way. Some will be less or more efficient, but you want to be the one that is, okay, if I just do this for 10 years, I'll get a lot better, you know. And I would say my own partial understanding of that is more refined than ever, where training is even more straightforward than it's ever been for me. Now, some of that's come from experience, of course, and that's something you can't bypass, but the principles remain the same, just the way it's just slightly different.
I think a really good parallel to draw is if you look at golf swings. So golf swings, if you look at tour pros, there'll be small intricacies, right? Somebody, like, it might be like the Scotty shuffle where his 2 feet shift to the side and it's follow through. It might be somebody opening up more in the backswing. It might be somebody really bearing down a small bit more. But essentially everyone's making contact with the ball with as straight a club face as they possibly can. They're trying to put it in as much club speed as possible on the drive as they can, and they're just controlling that impact. So, like, everybody's rotating through, everybody's following 99.9% of those parameters, and then sometimes you get some intricacies. People in weightlifting make the incorrect assumption that because of differences in body shape, differences in maybe ability to produce maximal power, differences in talent, that they're going to lift the barbell slightly differently. I have really long legs, so I'm going to do X. I'm not that fast, so I'm going to do Y, right? I won't move my feet so I can get it underneath, whatever it is. Everybody is different. Everybody should be following the same model. And I think we want to look outside, like you're saying, you don't understand why people want to be different. I think people want to be different to give themselves that thing of like, no but. So you'll say, don't bend your arms in the clean, and they'll say, no but. Don't move your feet during the golf swing, no but. And that no but and wanting more no buts is just, it's not a laziness thing, but it's just to give themselves that bit more of a scope for making that mistake.
Like, there's no Fosbury flop coming for weightlifting technique. There's no
absolutely not
Fosbury flop coming. It's a Fosbury flop, isn't
yeah.
it? Yes. There's none of that coming for strength training in terms of programming or technique by and large. Maybe a little bit for technique. Is not really for technique, to be honest. They're fairly well established.
Once we saw, like in powerlifting, once we saw the rule change for bench press and stuff.
But in terms of, forget about powerlifting. Like, we're not talking about rules. Like, we're talking about squatting and deadlifting more, or benching more.
Yeah.
Like, the Fosbury flop came for weightlifting. It was making contact, not pressing, and not split snatching or split cleaning. Like, that was the Fosbury flop, and that happened. And there's nothing different coming now, which I maintain is a good place to be at, because then you can, if you can find the right knowledge, you're probably on a good path. If you're watching Sika Strength, you're listening to this. If you're in a position where you want to do weightlifting, you can go, this is the thing I need to do. It doesn't make it easy. It's still very hard to get better at weightlifting, but you can just do that and figure it out and draw from those sources of knowledge, implement this Fosbury flop era, and then get better. Like, that's good. That's good. And
absolutely, it is.
I know people. I don't know what aboutism, but there is a bit of a trend at the moment I see in weightlifting, if we go by commenting or whatever, that everyone lifts individually, and I think you haven't enough granular detail looked at if you think that, because would you be able to pick out this person's bar pat if I showed you 5 different elite lifters' bar pats? And what if I showed you that person's bar pat and someone lifted more? Like, would you be able to pick your persons out? You know, if you start looking at the body in relation to the barbell, things might look different, but are they following those parameters? And they are. And if they're not, then there's a great chance they could be lifting more based on those parameters, you know, depending on who you're looking at. And again, I do want to emphasize, it's not me being like, I invented this method. Me and Dara and I invented this method, and that's what they're adhering to. Someone figured this out in the 80s and the 70s. Yep. And we're like, yep, that's the one.
There definitely are still floppers out there as well in the weightlifting world. Like, I think the squat jerk was an attempt at a Fosbury flop to try and limit the total bar height you'd have to achieve or whatever. Thankfully, though, I actually don't think, like, as you said, it's a great time to be training as a weightlifter. This is the time when you're going to make the most progress. Like, if you were in the 60s and 70s trying to be a really good runner and track spikes were running or falling apart all the time, it would have been terrible, right?
Don't mind the 60s and 70s, 2010.
But whatever it is, right? You want to be in the most settled and well-refined point of a sport if you want to make the best progress in it. I get it that there can be these kind of supernovas out there where it's just going to explode and it's going to do crazy things. If you were swimming and you got a shark suit and nobody else had a shark suit, you would suddenly be there. But the problem is, once something like that comes along and it's a major sporting innovation, or essentially technical doping, once...
Why'd you look at me like that?
Why, did you have a motorcycle in your bike? But once one of those things comes along, your advantage only lasts for a very short period of time. Like, success leaves clues, and large-scale success leaves large-scale cues. Like, if somebody wears a shark suit to Sydney, by the next Olympics, everybody's going to have one, or it'll be banned. Fosbury does the flop. By 5 years later, every single high jump record has been broken. They're not the times when you're going to make the best progress, because everybody else is going to be getting this massive uplift as well. Like, you want to be the most consistent. You want to be the steam train just trucking along. Nobody's going to stop you. And that's one of the great things about, I think, gym culture getting so big now, and those things becoming more and more well refined, even down to selecting supplements and getting supplements on a semi-regular basis, right? When we were getting supplements as like 16, 17, 18-year-olds, you were ordering a bag of serious mass from Optimum Nutrition, and you'd be like hoping that it's going to be edible when you get there because the flavors are going to be all over the place. You might be getting a bucket of mass gainer off your mom's friend's son who's moved off to college and he left this behind in his house. No consistency there, right? So now you have, even in the boots and equipment world, you can order a pair of weightlifting shoes now that are going to be the best pair of weightlifting shoes you ever have. Go back 15 years ago and you would have been sending a check in the post to Germany and hoping that a pair of weightlifting shoes arrives.
The Manfred Nerlinger.
Yeah.
Hopefully you get your Eddie Powers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I suppose, because of the current state of the world, people can be skeptical. They can assume because you're saying a certain thing, you're trying to commercialize it and sell it. You know, there's a skepticism around business that you could be, some people have this, I'm sure it's a small percentage of the population, but there's this inherent default thought that because there has been people before who are complete dumbasses who try and sell things knowingly or unknowingly, who have incorrect information, that you get lumped in with those people.
Yeah.
And you're in a position where you have somehow been, because you're saying something that might be different to other people, that you are somehow also that charlatan. Which I suppose is up to the person to figure out.
Yeah, I would always be very, very cautious of, particularly technique-wise, coaches who make their living off or make it of, this is the technique and you're going to follow this and you can only be coached this technique effectively if you're doing it with me or whatever. That always screams charlatan for me.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks very much for listening.